Good morning, good evening, afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We are glad to have you. I can see we are about almost hitting 500 participants and still the number is growing. So this is one of the webinars that is aligned for the 2021 World Environment Day that is taking place in tomorrow. And this year, the World Environment Day is being hosted by the government of Pakistan, and thanks to them, under the theme of ecosystems restoration. And this webinar precedes tomorrow's World Environment Day celebration that will be celebrated globally and with a specific hosted by the Pakistan. So today's webinar is focusing about the sustainable nitrogen management for ecosystem restoration. Once again, we welcome all of you on board, and we look forward to having a very interactive session, as well as we share a lot of knowledge from the panelists that are on board, and as well from many questions that you'll be posting here. So as you see on the agenda, we should have had His Excellency the Minister of Pakistan joining us to make his opening remarks, and that is His Excellency Malik Amin Aslam. But unfortunately, he's not able to join us. But we'll move on as well to the next speaker, who was to give an opening remarks. That's Joyce Musuya, the Deputy Director for United Nations Environment Program. And as well, I'll share a link for Ms. Joyce that he has prepared for all of us. So I'll just launch the video on.
I'm very pleased to see the very strong interest in this webinar with over 1,600 registrations from all over the world. This webinar comes right after the successful conclusion of the landmark 8th International Nitrogen Conference hosted by the German government from Berlin earlier this week. In a few hours, the UN Decade on Ecosystem...
Milka, we cannot see Joyce's video. We can only see your screen. Maybe you'd like to start again?
I'm sorry. Let me just do that again. Sorry, I thought you were following. Just a minute. Let me know if you can now see the video.
I'm very pleased to see the very strong interest in this webinar with over 1,600 registrations from all over the world. This webinar comes right after the successful conclusion of the landmark 8th International Nitrogen Conference hosted by the German government from Berlin earlier this week. In a few hours, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2021-2030 will be formally launched as part of the 2021 World Environment Day celebrations. The new decade calls for the protection and revival of ecosystems all around the world, with focus on resetting our relationship with nature. The UN Decade runs from 2021 through 2030, which is also the timeline for the Sustainable Development Goals and the horizon that scientists have identified as the last chance to prevent catastrophic climate change. Led by the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, the UN Decade aims to build a strong, broad-based global movement to ramp up restoration and put the world on track for sustainable future. That will include building political momentum for restoration, as well as thousands of initiatives on the ground. On nitrogen, one of the big challenges is summed up by the slogan, everywhere and invisible. Nitrogen losses are hard to see, whether we are talking about diffused pollution from agriculture, wastewater, or nitrogen oxides emissions from burning fossil fuels. Nitrogen deposition affects ecosystems in many ways. In general, we see that when nitrogen deposition increases, natural biodiversity decreases. For example, the consequences of excess nutrient leaching and runoff for freshwater and marine ecosystems involve hypoxia and coastal eutrophication, leading to an increased number of dead zones, which have quadrupled in size since 1950. The depletion of nutrient stocks in agriculture soils in nutrient-poor parts of the world poses a risk for ecosystems and biodiversity by encouraging agriculture incursion into previously virgin ecosystems that contain nutrient stocks sufficient for crop growth. Ladies and gentlemen, like some of you at the webinar today, I was in Sri Lanka when nations negotiated and associated themselves with the Colombo Declaration on Sustainable Nitrogen Management, with an ambition to halve nitrogen waste by 2030. This was a massive step. A reduction of this magnitude would lead to immediate benefits in the fight against climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. It would also generate US dollars 100 billion in savings and foster innovation in the agricultural, energy, and transport sectors. Setting targets is one thing, but achieving them is another. If we are going to meet this one, then we urgently need to do the following: improve the performance of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, increase the use of organic fertilizers, and boost the recycling of nutrients from agriculture. And we will also need to significantly reduce our consumption of meat and dairy and dramatically cut the amount of food we waste. Another challenge that looms large for us is the broad lack of awareness on this important topic. Policymakers and general public are poorly informed about the nature and scale of the nitrogen crisis. This is why the UN Global Campaign on Sustainable Nitrogen Management is so important. It aims to explain how tackling the nitrogen crisis triggers a cascade of other benefits, whether it's water, air, climate, biodiversity, or stratospheric ozone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing a triple planetary crisis: pollution, biodiversity, and climate change, a crisis the likes of which humanity has never faced before. The disruption of Earth's nutrient cycles remains as urgent as global heating and biodiversity loss. So we're going to need to treat these problems with the urgency they deserve. And that means we need to see a major upscaling of efforts from all walks of life and across all sectors: governments, academia, private sector, farmers, and civil society. Let us put our hands together and intensify our common efforts to promote sustainable nitrogen management for ecosystem restoration. I wish you all a very interesting and engaging webinar. Happy World Environment Day. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you so much. That was a quite informative opening remarks from Ms. Joyce. And it's just to narrate on what she's mentioned, that, you know, setting targets is something, but when you talk about achieving those targets, then calls for a global collaboration between the policymakers, the citizen, and as well other stakeholders. And when she mentioned about the global nitrogen cycle, nutrient cycle, then it needs to be taken with the much heavy weight that it deserves so that we can have a better environment. So thank you so much for that, Joyce, in absentia. And now allow me to go to some of the housekeeping rules before I give the floor to Aisha, who is my co-facilitator for this opening session. So I'll share my screen here. I hope you can see that. So just to remind you is that all participants are on listen only mode. Please use the question box for you to be able to post your questions, and from where the panelists will be checking, and we'll try to address all your questions. And as well, all participants are encouraged to state your countries or your organization against your name. That's easy. You just go to edit and you put your name and country and the organization that you're representing. And as well, just to remind us all is that additional documents for this meeting were made available on the UNEP website under the link that is visible here. But for ease of reference, we put those documents under the handout box, which is below. So you can just click on it and you'll see the agenda, the speaker's profile, and as well other relevant documents. And also just to mention is that after the webinar, we will be issuing the e-certificate to all the participants that have participated in today's webinar. And so we look forward to that. So allow me now to invite my co-facilitator, Aisha. Please put on your camera and over to you, and I wish you all a very successful meeting ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Milka. I welcome all of you from Pakistan. It is a matter of great pride that Pakistan is hosting the World Environment Day. I would like to invite our next speaker of the day, Dr. Tariq Aziz. Dr. Tariq Aziz is working as associate professor and principal at sub-campus Dipalpur, Okada at University of Faisalabad, University of Agriculture, Faisalabad. He is lead partner from Pakistan in UKRI GCRF South Asian Nitrogen Hub. He will highlight in his presentation about the launch of the book, which is present an excellent compilation of the research-based findings in the first comprehensive assessment of nitrogen use and current scenario of nitrogen pollution in Pakistan. Over to you, Dr. Tariq.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Milka, can you please give the presentation?
Yes,
so that
start
I can
your share screen.
Yeah, thank you. So can you share? Can you see my screen, please? Can you confirm it? Aisha, can you please confirm that it's seeable and I'm audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see your screen.
Okay.
Yeah, your first slide is there.
So, Her Excellency Joyce, Deputy Executive Director, UNEP, and Mike and Muslim, who could not join us in this. Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Anis Qureshi from University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, respected panelists, dear colleagues, faculty members, and all of the participants. I'm thankful to all of you for joining us on this awareness seminar, which is Mood of the Day, Sustainable Nitrogen Management for Ecosystem Restoration. This webinar is jointly organized by United Nations Environment Programme, Ministry of Climate Change, Government of Pakistan, University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, South Asia Nitrogen Hub, INI, GPNM, and World Environment Day 2021, which is hosted by Pakistan. And we are very proud that Pakistan's efforts for ecosystem restoration are now recognized by the world. But climate change is not a story or a fiction. It is happening now. Just an example of two pictures from the same region. We either have too much rain are more. So actually, we humans have pushed climate change, biodiversity loss, shifts in natural cycles, long years beyond the tolerance limits of planet Earth. And preventing, halting, and reversing the degradation of ecosystems worldwide to empower to climate change, combat climate change, and prevent biodiversity loss is the basic objective of today's webinar and the theme of Current World Environment Day. The most, and I think the most important challenge to humans' existence on this planet is food insecurity. Nearly 1 out of 8 experience chronic hunger, that is nearly 870 million people worldwide, they face severe hunger. And I'm talking just the chronic hunger. So, very much important and the significant challenge to humans' existence on this planet is food security. And during 2019, the challenge and the situation has become more worse because of the pandemic 2019. So we have to produce more food if the population rate is going to increase at the trend, and we will have more 2.5 billion more mouths to feed. And as per estimates, about we need 70% more food than the current food production. And over 50% of global food production relies on synthetic nitrogen fertilization. So we can say that nitrogen fertilization is critical for sustaining life because it is critical for food production. And if there is no synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, there may be 50% reduction in the current world food production, increasing the hungers as well as increasing the poverty. However, the excess and inefficient use of nitrogen causes serious environmental concerns because the nitrogen, which is being added up to many of the sectors, the nitrogen use efficiency is only 40% on average, but in some sectors it may be around 23 to 24%, particularly in livestock sectors. And the nitrogen which is not being used by the livestock sector or by the crop sector, the cost of this waste nitrogen is about US $200 billion. So this is a huge amount which can be utilized to achieve any other sustainable development goals if nitrogen sustainable management is there, and we can save the waste of nitrogen. Excess of nitrogen, which is access to the need of plants, or plants cannot take up those nitrogen from any of the sectors. It causes environmental impacts on air quality, water quality, biodiversity loss, health issues, and all of the climate change. So all of these factors will ultimately impact on ecosystem and deteriorate the ecosystem, and by sustaining nitrogen management, we can improve ecosystem restoration. So as sustainable nitrogen management is linked with most of the sustainable development goals, and goals like zero hunger, 2, clean water and sanitation, life below water, climate action, life on land, good health and well-being, decent work and economic growth, and many others too. So I will discuss here a little bit about the book which we have published, which we have written. The idea for writing or getting the data collection for Pakistan's nitrogen assessment was conceived in an inception meeting of South Asia Nitrogen Hub, which was established during 2019 in February at Mumbai. And the idea was then discussed with Elsevier academic press, and it was accepted. And now the manuscript has been submitted to the publishers, and we are hopeful that we will get it printed in September 2021. I will briefly discuss the contents. This book covers rethinking nitrogen use, plan to beyond than present, nitrogen in relation to food security, human health, and economic stability, the available information on nitrogen status, sources, sinks, and drivers of nitrogen use in Pakistan, as well as we have discussed mostly the South Asia, nitrogen use efficiencies in crops, issues, and challenges, and nitrogen emissions and their impacts on ecosystem health, the available nitrogen measures, policies aiming at increased nitrogen use efficiency in crop and livestock sectors, and lastly, we have identified or suggested some actions which are immediate to be addressed. So, if we talk about Pakistan's contribution to the global greenhouse gas emissions, it is nearly negligible. But on the other hand, it is the fifth most vulnerable country to the climate change. So, and agriculture sectors is the main emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in Pakistan as well as around the globe. And if we can manage the nitrogen in agriculture sector, if we can improve the nitrogen use efficiency in agriculture sector, we can reduce significantly the emissions. So, as we have to produce more food, the nitrogen use has been increased linearly with the food production. And this is the case just an increase from 1960 to 2015. We have the nitrogen use has been increased from less than 500 gigagram nitrogen per year to about 5,000 gigagram per year. And if we see the nitrogen harvested by the crops, there is a difference between the nitrogen use and the uptake. It is about 4,000 gigagrams. So this is a huge amount. And this huge amount is available to be released to the environment, damaging air quality, water quality, and causing biodiversity loss and a number of other environmental impacts. And this huge amount can be saved and can improve the economic growth as well. So if we see the nitrogen emissions from 1960 to 2001, the nitrogen emissions have been increased significantly because the nitrogen use have been increased in the past. So it is directly related to the nitrogen use. Means we have used very much high amount of nitrogen, and resultantly, because of low nitrogen use efficiency, the excess amount is released to the environment in the form of N2O, NO2, and ammonia, both from fertilizers and as well as from the manures. So if we compare the Pakistan versus global nitrogen use and use efficiency, we can see that Pakistan is on the bottom side for partial factor productivity. It is example for wheat, nitrogen use efficiency, and also mean grain yield. But if we compare the nitrogen inputs, we are adding about 200 kilograms nitrogen per hectare, means we are on the other side. So it is a clear indication that nitrogen use efficiency is seriously low and need to be addressed immediately. So if we fail to stop nitrogen pollution, it will limit the safe operating margins for many other issues facing our planet Earth. So a holistic and joint up approach is needed to reduce nitrogen pollution at national, regional, and global scale. Every individual, every nation, every region, and the globe are responsible for this. We have to act in a joint up approach. So action needed which have been proposed in this book are to improve nitrogen use efficiency in agriculture, management of biological nitrogen fixation, use and recycling of organic nitrogen resources, because this is a very big resource which can be improved. And very importantly, we have to reduce food wastages, because for food production, a huge amount of nitrogen is being used. And balance between meat and dairy products. We have to set national action plans, not only in Pakistan, but throughout the globe to reduce nitrogen pollution. And for Pakistan particularly, we have to revisit national agriculture policy and fertilizer policy to give more importance for sustainable nitrogen management. So special thanks for Ministry of Climate Change, Ministry of Agriculture Faisalabad, United Nations Environment Programme, South Asia Nitrogen Hub, and I'm looking forward for a very fruitful and wonderful technical session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tariq, for such a comprehensive presentation about the nitrogen, invisible and everywhere. Now I will ask Mr. Mahesh that he will continue the further session. Over to you, Mahesh.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and thank you, Dr. Tariq, for that very comprehensive presentation. We now move on from the opening session and this pre-launch of this book to our keynote statements. We have 5 presenters, and all of whom will share very interesting aspects. So without further ado, and just to remind you, as Milka mentioned, that please put your questions in the chat box below. We have slightly more than 600 participants on the call now, so we look forward to engaging with the speakers. So the first keynote speaker, and if I may ask Mark to also briefly introduce himself and tell us more about the South Asian Nitrogen Hub. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. And if you can give me screen rights. I'm waiting to get screen rights.
Mark, maybe a quick introduction from yourself before.
Yes. Yes, happy to do so. So I'm Mark Sutton. I'm based in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I'm leading the South Asia Nitrogen Hub, based from Scotland, with all 8 countries of South Asia, including Pakistan, and also leading the International Nitrogen Management System with UNEP, funded by the Global Environment Facility, and together the other activity is the Task Force on Reactive Nitrogen. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, if I can have the screen rights.
Mark, you have the screen rights already.
Okay, thank you. So tell me, can you see this?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And good morning, good evening to all of you. So I'm going to say a few words about nitrogen and ecosystem restoration and emphasize the role of the Global Challenge Research Fund, South Asia Nitrogen Hub, in that process, which more widely contributes to the International Nitrogen Management System supported by the Global Environment Facility and UNEP. I'm going to say at this point, that's probably the end of all the acronyms. You've had enough acronyms. What's the topic in hand? And so why nitrogen and ecosystem restoration? The first thing to say is that ecosystem restoration means putting the right conditions in place for ecosystems to flourish. So what are the right conditions? It means all conditions, and nitrogen is one of them. Nitrogen is the stuff of life, from proteins to DNA. They're all nitrogen compounds. That means that too little nitrogen is really a limit to ecosystem productivity. In farming, you've just heard from Tariq Aziz about how fertilizers have increased productivity. But many natural ecosystems are naturally nitrogen limited. And that's a good thing for those ecosystems. It supports biodiversity and biological richness. Too much nitrogen threatens ecosystem balance and can also be toxic. We've heard already from Joyce, nitrogen is everywhere and invisible. And what that means is that whatever our restoration goal, getting nitrogen right is a precondition. If it's restoration through restoration of aquatic balance or restoration of changing ecosystems. Whichever way we look at it, we've got to get the nitrogen right. And that means that if we're going to be successful in the UN decade of ecosystem restoration, which we are now starting this week, at the same time, we must have a nitrogen decade, a decade of nitrogen action contributing to that decade of ecosystem restoration. So what about nitrogen in the environment? Just going to give you a few nitrogen forms. It's the basic chemistry lesson. But dinitrogen is a triple bond between those two nitrogen atoms. It's really stable. It's every breath we take is 78%. It does nothing. It makes the sky blue. But when we convert it into ammonia, that becomes a form of air pollutant or water pollution. Nitric oxide is a form of air pollution, and from cities, from burning, from vehicles. Nitrogen dioxide is the product. When that starts reacting, and together those make NOx. Nitrates, when they're further oxidized, and that can be nitrates in the atmosphere in particulate matter, can be nitrate in watercourses in pollution. And at the end of this list, nitrous oxide. And that's the greenhouse gas, but it's also depleting the stratospheric ozone layer. So nitrogen, we've said, it's everywhere and invisible. It's all these different nitrogen forms contributing to multiple problems. So we say nitrogen's everywhere and invisible, and here we are, it's in the news again this week. The Express Pearl ship, we've heard about this sad story, the burning, the sinking ultimately. And for a while, I didn't realize this was a nitrogen story, but again, it is a nitrogen story. The ship was carrying nitric acid, and it seems as if that nitric acid leak may have started the fire. Having got the fire started, then it's actually releasing huge amounts of nitrogen oxide emissions to the atmosphere. The net result of all of that, once the oil comes ashore, is massive coastal impacts that will take years to recover. So this is really joining in with part of a nitrogen story. And just to say that the whole business of carrying large amounts of nitrogen around is really dangerous. This is a picture of the Beirut explosion, which in this case was an explosion of ammonium nitrate. So nitrogen is a really challenging, explosive material. We've got to be careful how we handle it. Let's just look through the cascade of nitrogen effects in the environment. We're starting with fertilizer manufacture and also crop biological nitrogen fixation. And then we're putting that in to grow our crops, but we're losing nitrous oxide, nitrogen oxides, ammonia, leach nitrate. When we put in animals, we get even bigger emissions. We've got the combustion sources as well, which add further to these emissions. But as this cascade continues, those compounds react in the atmosphere, going down rivers. The ecosystems become saturated until there are further emissions, leading ultimately to denitrification until it's back to N2. And in the process of that gradual dissipation of energy, a whole host of nitrogen problems resulting. Now, in that cascade, the nitrogen is dissipated gradually. In the explosion, it's dissipated all in one sudden whammy. But meanwhile, both cases are a dissipation of energy that's contained in these nitrogen compounds. So we've got this massive challenge, and all these nitrogen losses are forms of nitrogen waste, of which in the world, 80% of the nitrogen resources we're putting end up being wasted. And as our colleagues have said, the Colombo Declaration is now there. It has this ambition to halve nitrogen waste towards 2030 over this nitrogen decade, the ecosystems decade, looking to save $100 billion per year. So let's take this into a bit more detail in terms of ecosystems and restoration. Here's a photograph of me holding some sphagnum. It's a moss. It's really important for peatland functioning. The colorful one is healthy, the brown one is dead and dying. And the story here was that a poultry farm, chicken farm, was built without permission very close to this nature area. The peatland vegetation is damaged in all sorts of ways, lots of species lost. In particular, this sphagnum moss is killed. That is not just a biodiversity loss, but that is also a threat to carbon storage on this site, linking to climate issues. The nitrogen pollution is having toxic effects from its alkaline effects on the bog. Now, a legal case study then led to the result that this farm would ultimately close. They were not allowed to have the farm next to this nature area. The interesting thing then was that the biodiversity started recovering, and with substantial recovery within 5 years of that farm closing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against farming, but the bottom line was that farm was in the wrong place. We need to think about our landscape structure, having things in the right place. And of course, ultimately, a chicken farm, if the best mitigation techniques were put on board and a commitment was made and it was in the right place, it would have much less environmental impact. But the message is here, if you take action, restoration is possible, and not only that, within the decade. Here's a quick picture. Around this picture, the bright yellow is the recovering sphagnum. That was completely gone while the farm was there, and now you see it rapidly growing back in again, restoring in this site. The same site actually is showing slower recovery for the trees. On the right-hand side of this picture is a really slimy tree trunk covered with algae. That's not what you should be seeing, but that's what happens near the farm. And on the left-hand picture, what it should have been looking like. And I have to say, we're not yet there with this site. It's taking longer. It may take a couple of decades. We need patience with ecosystem recovery. So let's take this down to South Asia, and we're looking at nitrogen effects in sub-Himalayan forests. It's a global hotspot of nitrogen pollution in South Asia, particularly the Indo-Gangetic Plain. There are these nitrogen-sensitive forests, and they're being harvested in various places for perfume manufacture as an ecosystem service of those forests. But those nitrogen-sensitive lichens, we think, are suffering from this nitrogen air pollution, is now being studied under the GCRF South Asia Nitrogen Hub. And here's a quick picture of our measurements, modeling, in fact, in this picture. And you see the northern sub-Himalayan zone, and the green is extent of forest cover, and the two red ones show the extent to which dangerous levels of ammonia and nitrogen deposition are exceeded. And really, these are very high levels compared to the environmental thresholds. So we'll be going out once the COVID pandemic is passing, sampling lichens in these forests in relation to these nitrogen pollution gradients. So what would it mean in this instance? It's big scale pollution, not a single farm, but millions of farms. It means up to 2030, we need regional change, halving that nitrogen waste to reduce emissions, improve air quality. And of course, that means also major human health, economic and climate co-benefits at the same time. And that means the kind of practices that Tariq Aziz has just been talking about. And we're really happy to announce today that we're going to be extending this work to include Pakistan, building on our existing partnership with the University of Agriculture from Faisalabad and other partners. So what about Pakistan's famous billion tree tsunami? We're really excited, of course, always to be hearing about this program, but my message would be there's also nitrogen opportunities here. The planted forests provide a nitrogen sink that can help reduce air pollution and water pollution. The nitrogen sink then helps the forests themselves to absorb carbon, helping in terms of climate. Of course, better soil structure and water balance will also at the same time help mitigate the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. Really, there are multiple benefits of this kind of action. I think going forward, I would say there is a potential for further engagement in this whole issue of landscape design, having things in the right place in relation to how to get the best from agriculture and the best from forests fitting together. So we need to go forward with nitrogen innovation. My message is that these are all linked up: ecosystem restoration, climate, circular economy. As we learn to manage nitrogen better, recycle and recapture with these actions in agriculture, in industry, in wastewater, in landscapes, all of these are needed to help move us forward. And together with that, the whole issue about food choice. Many of us are eating more meat and dairy than we need for a healthy diet. That will massively reduce our nitrogen losses, help restore ecosystems from a cleaner environment. So the way forward, ecosystem restoration and nitrogen management go hand in hand. They have to go hand in hand. Nitrogen is everywhere and invisible, but it should not be forgotten. It brings issues together: climate, air pollution, marine environment, health, economic recovery. And as part of that, we have this whole goal to halve nitrogen waste, saving 100 billion a year. We're working with the United Nations Environment Programme and the countries in establishing something called the Interconvention Nitrogen Coordination Mechanism. If you think about the Climate Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, the water programs, the Global Programme of Action for the Protection of the Marine Environment, these need to work together to get all the win-win approaches. And that is essentially implementing the UNEP nitrogen resolution. This year is the year of summits. It's a great opportunity, not only for World Environment Day to launch the Ecosystem Restoration Decade, but the Food Systems Summit, the Kunming Biodiversity Summit, the Climate Summit in Glasgow. And we're already starting meetings preparing the way for this, and very happy to report our launch of the Nitrogen for Net Zero initiative with an e-conference with the British Commission and the government of Sri Lanka a few weeks back. Go online, find out about that initiative. The bottom line is nitrogen for win-win actions. And here's our final message. We're really happy that we're working together between the South Asia Nitrogen Hub, supporting the GEF and UNEP in the International Nitrogen Management System, moving forward in this decade of action for nitrogen and ecosystem restoration. So with that, thanks very much.
Wonderful, Mark. That was really providing a very broad landscape of all the different things that are going on, including some very practical examples of nitrogen and ecosystems restoration. We now move on to our colleague from the German Ministry of Environment, Stephanie Walter, to tell us a little bit more about this Berlin Declaration, which was just a result of a meeting or a big international nitrogen conference that concluded yesterday, as Joyce mentioned in her opening. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mahesh. So I can't see my screen, but maybe you can give me a view on my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. It looks fine.
You can see my screen. Okay. So I can still see Mark. Mark, do you want to switch off your camera?
I thought
So
I
I like
had.
to see you, Mark, really.
I thought I was gone.
Okay. I do not know. Now I see my screen as well. So if I make any mistakes, just tell me, yeah? With the technique, I mean. So thank you very much for inviting me to this event and giving you a quick overview on the main issues, the main messages of the Berlin Declaration, the Berlin Declaration on Sustainable Nitrogen Management for the SDGs, which is the outcome of the 8th global conference of the International Nitrogen Initiative. Before I get to the point where I give you the key messages, just let me give you some numbers. Some numbers on the conference that just ended yesterday. So this large conference of the INI lasted from Monday to Thursday this week. The closing session was yesterday, while Central European time it was in the afternoon. It was planned as an in-person conference to be held in 2020 in May, and maybe some of you would have joined us, and maybe some of you joined us this week as well. As you know, it couldn't have been in person in 2020, so we postponed it, and now it was a pure online conference. It was free and it was open to everybody. The hosts, as formerly mentioned by Joyce Msuya, was the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, which I work for as a desk officer, and also by the German Federal Environment Agency. So we had 4 days of conference program with talks and keynotes, and we had a 4 hours program daily. Additionally, we had 4 hours of poster sessions. So altogether, we had 21 keynotes, including 6 national and international bodies, 180 presentations in 36 sessions, and 90 posters. Altogether, more than 1,000 persons registered to attend the conference, and they were coming from 60 countries. So those are the impressive numbers of the conference that has just passed. And now I will go over to the Berlin Declaration. I put it down to 4 key messages. I will give you the overview. The first message is better managing humanity's relationship with nitrogen is essential to the success of the SDGs. Of course, this is in line with the topic of the conference, because the topic of the I&I conference was nitrogen and the SDGs. As we already heard of Tariq Assis as well, nitrogen is connected to reach most of the SDGs. The further you get into it, the more SDGs you find out are connected to nitrogen. So first, we highlighted in the Berlin Declaration the unequal distribution of nitrogen use and loss. Of course, there are many countries that have surplus and excess nitrogen, but there are also countries that lack nitrogen, of course. So we highlighted that there are more than 2,500 policies that touch into nitrogen management and loss, but most of them are stressing food production and economic development. And they are underrepresenting environmental impacts and hidden costs. So what we stressed in the Berlin Declaration is the need to address potential trade-offs and synergies between SDGs and nitrogen management policies. The next key message number 2, is supporting ambitious goals at national and international scales. We highlighted the UN Colombo Declaration and, as was mentioned before, its ambition to halve nitrogen waste by 2030. The UN Colombo Declaration from 2019 and its ambition is very influential on the nitrogen targets set, for example, by the EU, the strategy, for example, on biodiversity, or the Zero Pollution Action Plan, the Farm to Fork strategy as well, and also on UN level and at the international level, let's say the CBD post-2020 process. So we support policymakers via the design and the evaluation of integrated policy options. And we especially would like to see to develop and improve nitrogen management practices and technologies for widespread use at farm levels. Another point is we want to promote recovery of nitrogen resources, as was mentioned before as well, from animal manure, from wastewater, and from industrial effluents as well. We want to support the shifts to healthy diets. As Mark just mentioned, a diet based on food with low nitrogen footprints. So skip the meat, at least partly, and the dairy products, and take more of the plant-based protein sources to just shrink your nitrogen footprint. Another point is education. Education is of relevant stakeholders and the general public, because most of the public is still not aware that we do have a nitrogen problem. You and me, yeah, we know the problem, but we have to spread the word, and we have to inform. We have to inform the public also to get support for policy action. So key message number 3 is the integration of sustainable nitrogen management objectives within environmental policy efforts across all scales. So we need to integrate nitrogen management within existing environmental policies. For example, the climate change policies, combating hunger, or protecting biodiversity. Like measures to mitigate climate change, also help in many cases to reduce nitrogen emissions. So there are strong synergies. See the synergies, but also mind possible trade-offs if there are conflicting goals. Yeah, see that. Another point is develop new integrated national and international nitrogen policies that make a more coherent and easily communicable approach to nitrogen management. Again, maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs. We put a special focus on the Geneva Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution that focuses on nitrogen oxides and ammonia. And we also highlighted the South Asian Cooperative Environment Program that promotes the regional cooperation on nitrogen and sustainable development. And now I come to the maybe most essential actual key message. Well, you can put it like that, get involved. So the most current and time critical keynote is use near-term opportunities to integrate sustainable nitrogen management with global policy efforts. Mark just mentioned it, and I can just stress what he said. There are upcoming opportunities, processes where you should do your best, yeah, to get involved, yeah, to highlight the need for a concrete nitrogen target to be implemented in these processes. It's the UN Food System Summit, as Mark mentioned, in September this year, yeah, just in front of the door. Glasgow Climate Conference of the Parties, COP26 in November 21, postponed from last year in Glasgow. The UN Convention, there's currently going on the negotiations of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020. It is linked to the Kunming Biodiversity Conference in October this year. So what's also going on is the revision of the Gothenburg Protocol of the Convention of Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, and also a current work on the Interconvention Nitrogen Coordination Mechanism. Mark is very much involved in this, proposed in the UNEA 4 resolution on sustainable nitrogen management. So I can only call you, get involved. So here's the summary of the 4 key messages of the Berlin Declaration of the 8th INI Conference. Better manage humanity's relationship with nitrogen, support ambitious goals, integrate sustainable nitrogen management objectives, and last but not least, use near-term opportunities. So my final message goes to you. The Berlin Declaration is still open for support. So if you want to subscribe the Berlin Declaration, it is a 3.5 pager. You will find it in full beauty on the ini2021.com internet page, and you can read it. And if you support our messages, we would be delighted if you supported us by subscribing the Berlin Declaration. So far from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful, Stephanie. Thank you so much for giving us this fresh message from the International Nitrogen Conference, especially get involved, the last key message. And I'm sure many participants will do so. So from this international focus, we now move to South Asia. Unfortunately, we do not have the Director General of the South Asia Cooperative Environment Program with us, but we have a representative, Samad Khalil, who will tell us more about a roadmap for South Asia. Samad, the screen is yours. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahesh. Just let me share my screen. Please let me know if the screen is visible.
Yes, now it comes. Yeah, Raghuram, okay. We will have you after this, so you can turn off your camera now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the SACEP's efforts in terms of addressing nitrogen management in South Asia. My name is Zaman Khalil. I'm the Senior Program Officer in SACEP. Just briefly, SACEP is an intergovernmental organization of 8 members, which includes Pakistan, with the purpose of addressing the prevailing environmental issues of the region. So there are 5 core areas that SACEP works on, which is waste management, air quality, climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable consumption and production. And as it happens that nitrogen management is one way or another relevant to all of these core programs. So in nature, the nitrogen cycles through one form to other naturally, and it's absorbed and emission, and it's all in good balance. And the problem starts arising when this balance gets upset. And when that happens, depending on what is happening and which substance, and whether it is in air, water, or the soil, the effect changes. So it can cause impacts on marine and terrestrial ecosystem, have impacts on food security, health, climate change, and air pollution. And different species of nitrogen compounds, even though each of them has its own benefits. Mark also highlighted that these exist in the natural environment, but when there is excess of it, it starts causes problem like ammonia, NOx, nitrates, and nitrous oxides, and each has its own set of problems. Now, why is this nitrogen issue a big concern for the South Asian region? Because South Asia is one of the hotspots of nitrogen pollution. The amount of nitrogen pollutant added to the region has increased through human activity from the 80s till date, and it will continue to increase as the projection suggests. And agriculture is one of the major source of nitrogen addition to the environment or the earth system. And I would like to highlight that the amount of fertilizers used in the region has increased almost 5-folds in last 30 to 40 years. But that's not without cause. We have nearly 2 billion people within the region to feed. So of course, agriculture is going to be a big component. We have a fast growing economy. So industrialization, energy use, everything, all of these contribute to this nitrogen pollution. And the bigger concerns is the impact of this pollution. And just a snapshot, the air pollution in the South Asian cities is among the worst globally. That's one reason. And it is costing declining health in the region. It's losing viable human lives as per WHO, which is not a good thing, which is never a good thing. And the one other reason, this has already been mentioned, that the South Asian region seas is experiencing hypoxia, or there's declining oxygen levels in South Asian seas region. And there are the red dots in the region highlights areas where there is almost lack of oxygen. And it was mentioned in the opening video as well. And these hypoxic regions are affectionately named as dead zones, because in these regions you see you don't see much living organic matter. It's dead organic matter. And it is important to note a large portion of the South Asian population depend on the coastal ecosystem services of the region. And there's a rich biodiversity at risk here. 6.8% of the global mangrove forest is in South Asia, including Sundarbans, which is the largest continuous mangrove forest. 6% of all global coral reefs is in South Asia, and it is one of the centers of coral biodiversity hotspots. The seagrass meadows cover a large, extensive area. We have rivers, deltas, and estuaries. I mean, if I keep listing the whole 10 minutes I can spend listing what are the sensitivities. So I'll just stop there, but I hope many would understand, and if you could go and do a little bit of internet research, you'll see a lot of biodiversity that is important and is in critical status in the region. So in point of biodiversity, one thing that in South Asia SACEP has been involved in is getting a marine and coastal biodiversity strategy, which was adopted in 2 years back in Dhaka, Bangladesh, with a vision of having a healthy marine and coastal ecosystem rich in biodiversity and continue to provide those ecosystem services and the well-being of the people. And it's all related to the social and economic development of the region. And one of the goal is to manage marine pollution, especially the nutrient loading to sustainable levels in South Asian Seas region. This is important to maintain the ecosystem service levels at a level that is sustainable and that is useful to the coastal communities. Of course, it has a target, but there's still a gap to it. And I think the nitrogen issues is a little bit more broader than the marine pollution issue. It goes much more into inlands and other ecosystems as well. Now, this has been mentioned multiple of times. There has been a growing amount of work ongoing with regard to the nitrogen issue. The blue part is the international different events and achievements. The green is the region, what has happened in the South Asian region. And SACEP started getting involved for the last, in around 2013 with nitrogen loading in South Asia Seas study. But we have been slowly getting involved more and more with being an official partner to the South Asia Nitrogen Hub project, as well as promoting the Colombo Declaration. And we are currently working with the South Asia Nitrogen Hub to form a regional policy for the countries to adopt. Now, SACEP has partnered with the South Asian Nitrogen Hub, and the idea is that the research work done by the South Asian Nitrogen Hub would directly feed information for the formulation of the policy framework. The regional policy framework will be developed and adopted with the support which will support cleaner and more profitable farming, as well as industrial recycling of nitrogen, fostering development of a cleaner circular economy for nitrogen. And must highlight, given the importance of nitrogen to farming and other things, it's important to emphasize that we need cleaner and circular economy with regards to nitrogen. Now, there are 4 different steps with regards to arriving at the nitrogen policy. First step is data collection, analyzing the present environmental situation. Second is evaluation of major gaps, challenges, and way forward. And next is building consciousness. One thing that has been repeated from the first speaker to the one before me is there's a lack of awareness, and that needs to be rectified. And that's one of the purpose of this third step, is to have multiple workshops for different regions and to understand and to explain to the stakeholders what this nitrogen issue really is. And then finally developing and finalizing a policy framework for the adoption by the SACEP Governing Council. The SACEP has a Governing Council where all 8 members have a stake, have a say in it. And once it is adopted, then those policy frameworks could be used for coherent policy making at national level for sustainable nitrogen management. Now, as I mentioned, the nitrogen hub, particularly the work package 1 or the research package 1, directly contributes to the work structure of the policy framework. Drawing information from research program 2, 3, and 4, research will help deliver key outputs for the different steps towards regional policy framework. And despite the pandemic, we have held our first regional workshop for the regional policy framework online in July 2020. And with the information provided and the desk research, unfortunately, the field research is severely hindered by the pandemic, but the desk research by the hub partners policy status paper, which evaluates the current status and the situation and gaps and challenges, has been produced and shared with the member countries. Briefly, just to say the key messages from the report, as everybody has said, South Asia contains several hotspots for reactive nitrogen pollution. It also highlights that NOx key sources of emission includes power generation, road transport, and industries, whereas nitrous oxide and ammonia pollution mostly comes from agricultural related emissions or other sectors, which includes wastewater management. It is also highlights that a total of 654 individual policies were found to have high to medium relevance to nitrogen management in the region, with the water sector being the most commonly addressed. So the barriers, I mean, this should be expected. There's lack of awareness at all levels. There's lack of data and scientific assessment to enhance the policy making. If policymakers does not know the implications of their policies, it's not a helpful policy. There's lack of monitoring and data. There's poor coordination between agencies for an integrated response. One thing about nitrogen is it's not limited to one sector. The agriculture nitrogen usage has impacts on biodiversity, has water management, has waste management implications. But these different agencies and our sectors are not properly coordinated, and that is something that needs to be improved, and not just within country but cross-border, because pollution does not respect the national borders. Of course, there's also some countries have highlighted the cost of using alternative technologies that would help reduce the wastage of nitrogen, which includes like neem-coated fertilizers or use of clean technology. There is a transaction cost, and the alternative technology cost seems to be higher than business as usual. But one thing to highlight is business as usual is not an option going forward. Now, it's also important to highlight that some actions are already undertaken or under consideration by South Asian governments, like improved management of sewage and solid waste, nutrient recovery, city composting, increasing the nitrogen fertilizer efficiency use, improve public transport or e-mobility, introducing introducing and incentivizing technologies and approaches to reduce nitrogen waste, implementation of emission standards for mobile as well as stationary, banning of crop residue burning. But crop residue burning is a common practice where once the season is over, you burn the crop and then you restart the plantation. And this has major implications to climate change with nitrous oxide emissions and NOx oxide. The promotion of integrated nutrient management through soil tests and leaf color charts, use of clean renewable technologies. It's important that I hear say clean renewable, because biofuels is also renewable, but when you use biofuels, you still emit nitrous oxide and NOxes as well. So biofuels doesn't necessarily address that issue. Thank you. That's it for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Samad. I think it was nice to get this intergovernmental perspective from SACEP working across all the 8 countries and highlighting this issue of the nitrogen challenge. Mark mentioned in Colombo, we are facing this crisis with this Express Pearl, the accident, so close to you, but it is a huge challenge. We have to be aware and we have to respond. So thank you very much for that intergovernmental perspective. Now we move on to, again, another presentation focusing on South Asia as a hotspot. And I give the floor to Raghuram, who in fact is the chair of INI. Maybe Raghuram, you can briefly introduce yourself and follow through with your presentation. Over to you. I think you're mute, Raghuram.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I am currently the chair of the Indian Nitrogen Initiative. I inherited it from Mark Sutton, who spoke earlier. I am a professor of biotechnology and has been a co-founder of the Indian Nitrogen Group and also involved with the UNEP Global Partnership on Nutrient Management, among other things. Let me move to the next slide. Well, you've seen this before, but I just want to use this to emphasize the point for those who are not very familiar. Nitrogen is not just one compound. The ordinary nitrogen is safe. Ammonia, nitric oxide, nitrate in dissolved waters, and nitrous oxide in air. These are different compounds of nitrogen which come from different sources like industry, agriculture, and they also affect different ecosystems, the aquatic ecosystem, the air, and so on. And more importantly, they come from different ministries, so handling them is actually quite a governance challenge. And this is an important message I wanted to highlight, especially in South Asia, where interministerial coordination is a difficult thing to get. This is just to get you a quick visual appreciation of where South Asia stands with respect to the rest of the world. For the 3 major nitrogen pollutants, in the, well, not exactly in the order of their dominance, nitrous oxide, which causes climate change, is in the middle, and you can see the Indian subcontinent is of the darkest color, so that means it has high degree of pollution in comparison to the rest of the world, one of the global hotspots. And NO2, which is a major component of NOx, an air pollutant, you can see that among all the global areas of on the map, you can see the Indian subcontinent is quite heavily polluted, and mainly it shows Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. The bottommost is ammonia pollution, for which the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, right from Pakistan to Bangladesh, seems to be quite a problem. And clearly, on all 3 counts, South Asia is a hotspot. Now, the main issue is that nitrogen is not just a new carbon, it is much worse, because there are multiple species coming from multiple activities, and they affect multiple ecosystems, biodiversity, human health. And because South Asia has higher population and higher growth rates, higher economic activity, higher agriculture, you also may witness higher pollution as a consequence of all these things. Plus, there are transboundary effects both within South Asia and the bordering regions. So therefore, it's not business as usual, and we must act as quickly as possible. Earlier today, I've heard that the G7 countries are holding a meeting on the financial investments on global affairs, and climate was supposed to be one of the important items to be discussed. And as you all know, G7 countries have so far been very stingy in meeting their own commitments of investing for the mitigation targets of the developing world under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, the major Rio Principle 7. Developed countries are yet to fulfill their investment commitments, and that's a very, very important thing to do. In order to help ourselves and the world, we need investments both from domestic and from international sources. And IMI conference has already been summarized, so I don't need to repeat. Now, just to give you again a quick idea of where we stand, these are unpublished results from the South Asian Nitrogen Hub data for all the three compounds which are shown in three rows. The top is the NOx, the middle is the ammonia, the bottom is the nitrous oxide. They just compared from 1970 to 2015. Now you can see that all three have worsened over this period. So of course, this is agar data coming from international satellite sources, but this needs to be monitored locally by the local agencies and addressed by the local governments and provincial governments. So we need to leverage these information, and the fact that air pollution is generally high on the media agenda as well as the public agenda. We even had some elections being fought on issue of air pollution in different parts of South Asia, including in the city where I live, in Delhi. So we should leverage that heightened public sensitivity and political sensitivity to air pollution by supplying more information about nitrogen and expand the agenda. If you have too much on climate, I'm not so sure if South Asian governments are all that excited about climate. But if you talk to them more about NOx, more about ammonia, they probably start listening because they know a bit about it. So to build on that. The good news is we have the scientific capacity and administrative capacity, and I'll try to demonstrate that. And in order to, if you use this capacity, supplement it with what is available elsewhere, there are win-wins for all stakeholders, both scientists, governments, civil society, industry, and everybody, and the world. Now, this was shown partially by Zamat before me, just to drive a simple point. I just want to show you that the same three species are now shown in columns, but in three different ways. The bottommost is the total nitrogen emission of each of the three species. The top one is in GDP terms. So if you see, even though it is increasing in total terms, but in GDP terms, as a ratio of the GDP, it is decreasing. But the most important thing is in per capita terms, it is increasing. And the one that is most increasing is the NOx. So this is the most important aspect. When we give per capita arguments to escape blame on nitrogen pollution in our region, we have to remember even our per capita pollution of NOx is increasing, and we can't escape that. Now, why does N matter much more than C? I was telling you that nitrogen is not just a new carbon, it's much worse. This is why. This table shows the different effects of major air pollutants, both direct and indirect health effects, acid rain, eutrophication, visibility, and climate change, direct as well as indirect. As you can see, NOx is the only thing that has all these effects, whereas all the others have only some or the other effects, but not all. So the WHO data on the end shows how air pollution and PM 2.5, which mainly half of it comes from nitrogen species, causes lung cancer, stroke, heart disease, lung disease, and various other problems. We already now have, a couple of years ago, Lancet Public Health publishing data on respiratory disorders, especially childhood asthma, due to NO2, which is a major component of NOx. And as you can see, India is only second worst in the whole world for this. Now, the bottom map of WHO shows up to 2 million people per year die due to PM 2.5. You thought COVID-19 was the biggest killer. Just look at PM 2.5. COVID-19 is nothing. PM 2.5 is killing every year much more than what COVID-19 probably killed in 1 year. This is NOx emission for the entire region. I just want to show you one small piece from the Indian nitrogen assessment, just to give you an indication where this NOx is coming from. It does not come from agriculture. It comes from mostly from transport, from industry, from fossil fuel burning, energy generation, coal, diesel. Not so much petrol, but diesel. Berlin apparently reduced its NOx and PM2.5 problem by simply banning diesel vehicles in the Berlin city and allowing petrol. We could have done that too. It's not a difficult thing to do. The rate of growth of NOx emission is much higher in the recent years than in the previous decades. Now, if you look at the whole South Asian region also, you'll find that South Asia, there is this pie chart shows that traffic and industry account for 2/3 of the PM2.5 pollution. More than half of it comes from nitrogen. Now, this is the water pollution problem. Maps from the Global Nutrient Cycle project of GPNM. You can see that the Indian subcontinent is in a problem both for dissolved organic inorganic nitrogen mainly, and also to some extent for organic nitrogen. The darker the color, higher the pollution. Now, agriculture is the main contributor for nitrous oxide, not NOx. And the second tallest bar here, the green part of it, is the amount contributed by agricultural soils, farm soils. So farm soils are the biggest contributor of nitrous oxide all over the world, but much more so in South Asia. So we have to look at agriculture. For example, ammonia emissions, this is the map only for India, based on our previous project, some of our colleagues from IRI. We need to generate similar stuff for the whole of South Asia. And this is on the global scale of use of fertilizers. So we are not much behind the rest of the world. In fact, we're only second worst after China in the use of fertilizer in the entire South Asia, including Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and quite an extent even Sri Lanka. So this has already been shown to show you that on the top of the arrow, these international developments on nitrogen, and at the bottom of the arrow, major developments in South Asia on nitrogen. So please take this take-home message. The awareness of scientists and their efforts to highlight nitrogen in South Asia is as old as the effort anywhere in the world. So we are not in the catching up syndrome. We are standing hand in hand with the rest of the world in highlighting nitrogen. And that's how you see that India facilitated the nitrogen resolution. Colombo facilitated the Colombo Declaration. Sri Lanka, much of the rest of South Asia is a part of it with us in doing this. And we are active in leading regional nitrogen assessment under INMS. And highest media coverage for nitrogen, we have done a recent study on that, is actually from South Asian region in the whole world. So this is, I don't want to read it, it's time already, but just to tell you various milestones. All this didn't happen overnight. We've been very active for more than 15 years to build the whole story to where we are now, nearly 20 years to be precise. We produced all these documents, all our activities are well documented. We started with a lot of initial burst of activity in India, and then we brought out a special issue of a current science journal in 2008. Then we brought out a series of sector-specific nitrogen bulletins in 2010 for the INI conference, culminating in the Indian nitrogen assessment in 2017. And I congratulate my colleagues from Pakistan, Tariq Aziz and the rest, for the forthcoming release of Pakistan nitrogen assessment, the second in the region of South Asia, later this year. And we also produced the report for South Asia, SACEP, on nutrient pollution, which was the starting point for the involvement of SACEP in regional coordination for nutrient agenda, and also more specifically the nitrogen agenda. Without that, we would not have made so much intergovernmental progress in this region as we are currently making. And much of this history is very well documented in a recent textbook chapter, reference book chapter that came out earlier this year on capacity building in South Asia for nitrogen assessment and management. You're probably aware that UNEP identified nitrogen as one of the top 5 threats to our planet. And of course, in the same month when it was released, same week, this resolution piloted by many South Asian countries, eventually tabled by India, was passed unanimously for the first time, giving the much needed fillip for action at the government level. Stephanie has already told you about the Berlin Declaration and the INI conference that ended yesterday, so I don't want to repeat it, but I just want to emphasize that we need to emphasize reduce, recover, and recycling of nitrogen, healthy diets, reduce animal protein, increase plant protein. Remember the role of the whole world under common but differentiated responsibility in attacking this global problem. Also, South Asia has been very active on mobilizing scientific documentation. These are just some special issues on reactive nitrogen. The first one on the top left is actually co-edited by me and Tariq, an excellent example of regional scientific solidarity, people-to-people partnership. Whatever our governments might say, we are one region, we are one people. And that's a very important message that I want to drive on this World Environment Day. We have to work together for the common problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raghuram, for that overview and really making the case for South Asia as a hotspot for nitrogen. With time constraints in mind, I think we should move quickly, but I just wanted to alert you that we have been receiving a lot of questions, so keep the questions coming. We will then put it to our panelists right after this last presentation. I will suggest to the panelists if they could please look at these questions and be ready to respond after this presentation. So from South Asia, we now move to North America, and we have our colleague Jill Barron. Unfortunately, it's very early in the morning for Jill. Thank you so much for being flexible and being with us. Jill, over to you to talk about North America and the mountain ecosystem. Jill, maybe your camera could be on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you
Great.
see and
We can see you
my
and hear you. Yeah. Raghuram, we can turn off our cameras.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm ready to go.
Yes, please proceed. We can see your slides.
Okay,
oh, good.
My name is Jill Barron. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey in the United States. It's an honor to be part of this nitrogen management side event as we start the decade for ecosystem restoration. I'm going to give you a very different view of nitrogen management today, but I think that it fits in very well. This is a local example, and it leads off of what Stephanie Wolter said earlier of getting involved, which was a main point of the recent Berlin Declaration. This shows how we can manage ecosystems at a very small scale. And one of the things you saw earlier today were pictures from Mark Sutton of peat moss, of algae, of lichens. When we talk about ecosystem restoration, those are really the types of examples of organisms that we are all working to protect. So we're going now from a global scale down to a very local scale. And my two important topics that I want you to come away with is that you need to get involved. You can see how nitrogen management works at all scales for ecosystem restoration. And then the other thing that I want to say, and you'll see this as I go through, is that protection of the most vulnerable ecosystems, such as what you're looking at here, in the end protects us all. Because if we can reduce nitrogen pollution to restore systems like this, then we can help with agricultural management, water quality, human health. So this example comes from the Rocky Mountains of North America. What you're looking at is a long-term ecological research program. The top of the mountains that you see here are at 4,000 meters. They go down to 3,000 meters. In the Western United States, this is a system in the Rocky Mountains. You can see it here. In 1983, it was instrumented in order to measure inputs and outputs of air pollutants. In 1983, you can see the team of scientists I was working with. That small crying person was not a member of the scientific community. She was my daughter. I was able to take her up to work with us over this time. Our objectives over time have not changed. The first was to differentiate natural processes from human-caused drivers of change. The second was to quantify the effects of atmospheric nitrogen deposition and climate change on these very nutrient-poor cold ecosystems. And the third, most important, is to share that knowledge with policymakers and managers so that they can take the best actions they can to protect our natural resources. This is in a national park in the United States, which already gives it protections from direct human use. So as we do our studies, we see that the only impacts are really from atmospheric deposition and climate change. So what happens in the Colorado Rocky Mountains and in many others, as well as in the Himalaya, you have natural and human generated emissions that occur on the plains. You have agriculture, you have industry, you have energy, transportation sectors. We heard about all of those just now from Raghuram happening in India. We also have an increasing risk, as does much of the world, from wildfire. These put up the pollutants we've heard so much about during the day. They're transformed and transported over to the mountains where they drop in terms of rainfall and dry deposition and have biological effects on park resources, national park resources. So when we started this study, we wondered how much nitrogen deposition is there. In the United States, which is what you're looking at here, the red levels are areas that are major agricultural regions of the United States. The darker the red, the higher the nitrogen deposition. So for instance, on the right-hand side, we have 18 to 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year in parts of the country that have intensive animal agriculture. In Colorado, which is that box on the left, and our little pointed area where I'm doing my research, it's much less than that. It's only 3 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. But still, that was enough to have us look for ask questions about, was that amount, which is actually an order of magnitude greater than the background, was that amount having an effect? So the punchline for all of these slides is that everywhere we looked, we saw nitrogen-caused eutrophication, fertilization. We saw changes in alpine vegetation. We saw changes in forest biogeochemistry, in the foliar concentrations of nitrogen, in the growth rates of the trees, and in the soils themselves. We saw strong changes in soil microbes, in fungi, in food webs. Surprisingly, we did not see an increase in carbon dioxide emissions over this time. We saw large changes in lake and stream chemistry, where nitrogen deposition was high in areas closer to sources. We saw high nitrate concentrations in the lakes and streams. We did not see that as you go to areas where nitrogen deposition was low. That nitrogen deposition caused profound changes in lake primary productivity. Algae are the base of the food web for the oceans as well as for all freshwaters. We saw very strong increases in algae. We saw big losses in biodiversity as some algae were better able to take up nitrogen than others. And basically, everywhere we looked, we found nitrogen-caused changes. We concluded that we were on a trajectory of increasing environmental damage. We were calling it change because we're scientists, but the National Park Service and the Environmental Protection Agency said, oh, that's change, but that's also damage. So we had gone from a change of soil and water chemistry to alterations of algae in lakes, to nitrogen saturation, to foliar chemistry, changes in our beautiful alpine communities. This is where we are today. And we argued that if you increase your nitrogen loading, the damage will only get worse. You'll move into chronic and episodic acidification, and it will eventually lead to forest die-off. So we said all of these things, they were published in the open literature. There was no question that what we were finding was supported by the papers that we published and the peer review that allowed them to do this. So what that caused was a cascade of impacts related to management and restoration. So the research up on the top left led to understanding of what was going on. It allowed organizations, in this case, the National Park Service, to develop a policy formulation that would allow restoration to occur. We had huge support from public advocates for restoration. And I want to emphasize that without non-governmental organizations, none of this would have taken place, because governments are very reluctant to change what they do. So having this advocacy was very important. And what it led to was an actual implementation of policy in the United States, sponsored by the state of Colorado, which is where we are, and the Environmental Protection Agency. What we now have, and it started in 2007, was the Rocky Mountain National Park Initiative, a nitrogen deposition reduction contingency plan. That's a mouthful, but what it says is that starting in 2007 and ending in the year 2032, we wish to reduce the nitrogen inputs to Rocky Mountain National Park by half. And by doing so, we will take these ecosystems below the critical load, below which there is no damage and above which there is. So when we looked at where all of our impacts were coming from, the emissions, we realized that agriculture was our major source. As we have transitioned over toward more renewable energy and to greening up our transportation sector, agriculture is now dominating in terms of 55 to 60% of the sources of emissions, ammonia basically, that cause impacts to Rocky Mountain National Park. So we developed a huge coalition of stakeholders who are polluters, but also would like to be part of the solution. And you can see some of them here: the corn growers, the dairy farmers, and many other people involved. And we meet quarterly to share information. We ask, what will success actually look like? Of course, reduced nitrogen deposition is the ultimate goal, but doing that through collaboration, especially with agricultural producers, is critical to get their agreement that they can support us, as well as supporting themselves with livelihoods and feeding the world. So this has been an incredibly important goal of ours, is to bring willingly the farmers and the agricultural industries along who wish to become part of the solution. The science policy partnerships are critical. Policy cannot be debated or decided in a vacuum without science to inform. Our public is very important. As you can see, those stakeholders were essential to making a change. Without them, nobody would have actually changed. And what I wanted what I started with and want to end with here is that protection of these most vulnerable ecosystems allows us to protect us all. It reduces human and environmental impacts everywhere. So thank you. I will end here and ready for a panel discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was very interesting. From the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, science policy linkages, it was amazing. So with that, maybe let me request all the panelists, the keynote speakers, to kindly turn on their cameras. And then we can address, we don't have as much time as we wish, but we can address some of the questions that came through. So let me start with Mark. And if there are any questions he would like to address in a very brief 2 to 3 minute intervention. Mark, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes,
great.
We can.
So I saw a couple of questions there. The first question was essentially whether one should be encouraging to reduce nitrogen inputs. bearing in mind the need for food. And wouldn't that be difficult, the questioner suggests, because that would compromise food production? I think my answer to that is I wouldn't start with that question. Exactly because of those risks. I would turn it around and say, what nitrogen losses have you got? What are you wasting? And more waste you've got, the more you're compromising your food, because it goes to waste rather than to food. So how can we work to reduce those waste? What are the measures? Take, for example, ammonia, and somebody has asked another question about ammonia, how to reduce ammonia emissions. The first step is keep it away from the atmosphere, because the warmer it is and the more connected to the atmosphere, the more is going into the air. And therefore, cover your manure tank. When you apply it to the field, incorporate it into the soil as soon as you can. And basically, that means that more nitrogen is going into your soil. That's contributing to your food production, helping your food security goals. At the end of the day, that may mean now finally, because you've saved nitrogen, you can reduce the inputs. But reducing the inputs came as a result of the actions you've taken, meant that you had the headspace to be able to do it. The second question I wanted to answer, somebody asked about the interconvention nitrogen coordination mechanism. And their question was, what about food waste? What about food loss and undernutrition? How can those issues be addressed in the INCOM process? And I think my answer to that is that INCOM, what we're seeing it's not a convention in its own right, but we want to get countries and conventions working together for all the win-wins across the nitrogen challenge. And that means that instantly I ask, which are the leading conventions and processes that have those in mind? Because of course we have the climate convention, the air convention, the water programs, convention on biological diversity, but yes, we must also take on board those food system. And I think that's where I look particularly to Food and Agriculture Organization, and who are indeed partners in that process. Clearly they're a key link. We're working on these issues in the task force on reactive nitrogen as well, on the whole issue of food loss. But what I think we will be seeing in the next years ahead is that the environmental conventions will be starting to look at goals in relation to these as well. And I know that under the revision of the Gothenburg Protocol that's starting, the question is exactly coming to this: how are we going to manage our diets better to meet our environmental goals? So I think see the INCOM as a process for bringing these conventions, and those are right at the forefront. Thank you.
Mark, Stephanie, any questions, comments you would like to address? Over to you.
Well, I was just asked for the link to see the Berlin Declaration, and I sent the link again to the organizers, for I could not spread it to all attendees. So maybe you can spread it somehow, because I was not able to send it to everyone. But I noticed the question and sent you the link via the chat. Thank you.
That we still have over 550 on the call, so it's amazing we can share that with them. Over to you, Zamath, in terms of any questions, comments in the chat you'd like to address.
Well, there's nothing specific with regard to my presentation, but I think there's one question which says enlist the name of countries which use large amount of nitrogen as a fertilizer. Just to highlight one thing, that all fertilizers usually have a large amount of nitrogen in it. So usually nitrogen is NPK, nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, and nitrogen is an integral part of fertilizers that is applied. Naming country's name in the region may not be a very fair way to go about it, because it depends on what the production is, the land size is, the population is. So it's pretty understandable when Professor Raghuram presented the per capita emissions of nitrous oxides or ammonia. It's pretty easy to infer that the biggest emitter would be the one with the largest population, or vice versa. But it's not a fair comparison to make between the countries, because each country has its own circumstances, and that needs to be understood. Where, for example, Afghanistan is a regional country which has net deficient nitrogen stock in its soil, whereas some parts of India has large amounts of nitrogen, or applies large amount of nitrogen in agricultural produce. Or even countries like Maldives, they don't have a monitoring mechanism. They don't have large agricultural fields, but the very small agricultural work that they do, they add a lot of fertilizer to it. So it's not really a fair way to answer. There's not really a fair way to answer that question. So that's what my comment is.
Mahesh, are you with us? I think we should go to Tariq, because Mahesh may not be with us at the moment.
Yes, can you hear me? Did I lose you? Okay, yeah, I was sorry. I was saying, Raghuram, maybe very briefly before we get on, in terms of some responses.
You need to unmute, Raghuram.
This always happens. Now you can hear me, right? Yeah, I was muted before. I was just answering some of the questions on the chat box when others are speaking. Hopefully, most of them are addressed. Point that many people are asking is whether nitrogen fixation by modifying the plant is possible, and whether the technology is around the corner. Unfortunately, the answer is not yet. Atmospheric nitrogen fixation directly by a crop is only possible in legumes or pulses. For all other crops, you have to, and if you have to grow it again and again, you either have to rotate legume with a cereal, or you have to add manure or fertilizer. There is no other way. So the other question was about plant growth promoting bacteria, PGPR, rhizobia, and fungi, whether they can help in nitrogen acquisition. This area is very controversial. For phosphorus, they are better known, but for nitrogen, there is very marginal effect, if at all. So it would still require external input, either as fertilizer or as manure. But there was a question about poultry. What is the link between poultry and nitrogen? The poultry droppings actually are the richest and the world's oldest source of fertilizer. So poultry waste should not be dumped because it becomes a pollutant. It's too rich in nitrogen to be wasted. It should be properly stored and used as a fertilizer, and that can reduce the amount of chemical fertilizer you can add. Similarly, you can do it for all other animal dung, manure, urine, even human wastes. In Afghanistan, I'm told human wastes are used as a manure for crops. So it's possible to ensure that many things which are well, some pollutants are nutrients in the wrong place. Let's just understand that first. Nitrogen is one of those pollutants which is actually a nutrient in the cropping system. Just keep the nitrogen where it is needed, and that will automatically solve the problem of pollution. So these are some of the a summary of some of the questions and answers that I have done so far. But if there's
Great.
anything more,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Raghuram. Jill, not sure if you had a chance to read through some of the comments and questions. Any quick feedback?
Just a quick follow-on what Raghuram just said about poultry, because the question was almost a surprise. How could they be a source of pollution? In at least the United States, poultry is an industry, and there are hundreds of thousands of chickens that are grown under covers of giant warehouses. And so it's a tremendous concentration of not just nitrogen, but also phosphorus waste. When that air escapes, it's a huge source of ammonium. But that's why poultry, we consider, at least in the United States, to be a huge source of pollution of both nitrogen and phosphorus.
Thank you so much, Jill. And to have the final word, and also in terms of the new Pakistan assessment, the pre-launch, Tariq, over to you in terms of some of the comments.
Thank you, Mahesh, and also the panelists who presented a very useful, wonderful, and collaborative presentations. And join us in studying the words for nitrogen pollution, how we can save from nitrogen pollution, how we can restore the ecosystem. So some of the questions which I have seen. Number one is, please name the countries using high nitrogen. So I think the high nitrogen users are in Asia, particularly China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and in Africa is Egypt, highest nitrogen users. So try to reduce nitrogen if it is required by the crops. So if we reduce the nitrogen use, we will face food production, reduction in food production. I think we are not convincing, or we are not making any statement that we want to reduce nitrogen imports. We want to improve nitrogen use efficiency, and if we want to, and if we get increased nitrogen use efficiency, means we have to add little nitrogen, because we have to add the nitrogen which is actually needed by the plants. At the moment, the nitrogen use efficiency is about 20 to 40% or 45% in some cases. It means that if we add 100 kilograms of nitrogen, about 60 kilograms of nitrogen is wasted. It is not taken by the plants, so it is not directly related with the food production. We want to improve nitrogen efficiency by any means, by integrating nutrient management, by improving genetic basis of the plants, or so a number of other means. So it's not actually the reduction in food production. The third question is, what are the factors for ammonia loss? So high humid soils, high temperature is very much relevant for the ammonia loss, and particularly from fertilizers which are applied on the surface and not incorporated within soil, and to manures which is fed, and to manure management. So manure losses are more from fertilizers industry and mismanagement of the manures. If we apply fertilizers at the right amount, at the right place, and at right time, there is 4 hours stewardship, which is adopted by Food and Agriculture Organization. Means you have to apply fertilizer at right amount, right source, right placement, and right method. So we can improve nitrogen efficiency. And the last question, which was how nitrogen pollution is important for Pakistan. As I have already said, that the total greenhouse gas emissions from Pakistan are very minute, less than 0.4% of the total. But we are not living as individual. Every nation has to work together. Pakistan is 5th most vulnerable country to climate change. So we all have to work together in a joint approach. Otherwise, we cannot give any of the sustainable development goals like net zero. We cannot achieve net zero. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. With that, let me just thank all the panelists, starting with Mark, Stephanie, Zama, Raghuram, Jill, as well as Tariq, for being very succinct and answering all the many questions that came through. Thanks to also the 520-something people still on the call. It's amazing for the 2 hours. But now for the concluding session, let me pass on to Abdul Wakil from our host organization in Pakistan. I'm delighted we have the new Vice Chancellor with us as well. But just on the cusp of this new decade of ecosystem restoration, the World Environment Day, And I think this is an excellent thing to connect nitrogen, sustainable nitrogen management with ecosystem restoration. So with that, many thanks. Over to you, Abdul Wakil.
Thank you very much, Mahesh, for the very excellent session, interactive session to highlight sustainable management for ecosystem restoration. So after that and the consequences has been balanced in the keynote speaker actually about environment. But the is also in the electronic not a very distinguished session is being included as both thanks and remarks by these speakers representing the climate change and University of Agriculture. First of all, I would like to invite Mr. Irfan Khan to present more things on behalf of the climate change. He is serving as Director General of Climate Change, and Mr. Khan is also serving as national focal person for recommendation framework. Furthermore, he is serving as vice chair working group 2 of IPCC. So I would like to invite to Mr. Fanta. Over to Mr. Fanta. Mr. Fanta is here in the list, and so I think he is maybe to internet connections. I think we move forward. We will have time for from
We cannot hear you clearly, Abdul. We cannot hear you clearly. No, I'm afraid we still cannot hear you clearly. The line is not clear.
Yeah, maybe Abdul, we can move to our two speakers from you. Let's start with and then move on to our Vice Chancellor. Mr. Javed concluding remarks.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much, Abdul Wakil. Good evening, dear panelists and all the participants. On behalf of University Faculty of Agriculture and Institute of Soil and Environmental Sciences, University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, I would like to thank all the participants, especially the panelists who are with us for the last 2 hours on this World Environment Day 2021 and sharing their opinions and views. The things which we were discussing, the nitrogen pollution is a serious threat to the ecosystem restoration, and it is not only the threat for the ecosystem, but it is also affecting the environment, and it is deteriorating the environment, but also we are viewing some biodiversity loss, and ultimately at the end this is ultimately contributing to the climate change. So in Pakistan, already Tariq Aziz told you about the scenario in Pakistan, but generally speaking, in the agriculture sector in Pakistan, the nitrogen use is not very high, but mostly the imbalanced use of nitrogen with the other phosphorus and potassium, there is a loss in the nitrogen use efficiency, and because of that there are more losses which are going to the environment, and especially in areas in the rice fields where we are using the submerged we are growing submerged rice, There is also a loss which can be controlled. Obviously, we are working on that. And also the major contribution is by livestock. In Pakistan, we are actually at the University of Agriculture, Faisalabad. We are a partner of the South Asian Nitrogen Hub working for the nitrogen management with possible agronomic and genetic solutions, which is very important to improve the nitrogen use efficiency. Our researchers, they are working on nitrogen emissions and its use efficiency in Pakistan. And they are involved in the hub and very motivated and dedicated. So we are hopeful that with our ongoing experiments and engagement at the different research packages, we would generate some data on emission of nitrogen from Pakistan also. So I think this is very important topic, and we have discussed on that. And it was also told that we are not major contributor while we are being affected by this. This is very true, and I hope that we will work together on this issue and to reduce the emission of nitrogen. Once again, I would like to thank all the delegates, the researchers, the participants who have joined us in this session of the World Environment Day 2021. Thank you very much.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Vice Chancellor. The audio is distorted. Abdul Wakil, if you could mute yourself, perhaps the VC's mic might be clear. Back to you, Vice Chancellor.
Can you hand-free? I think your laptop voice is okay, because we are not hearing your any of your voice.
Please go ahead. Abdul Wakil, please mute yourself.
It is an enormous task because production will have to be achieved with fewer land and fossil resources. For example, in Pakistan, about one-third of the households live below the food and poverty line, and they were not meeting their nutritional requirements. The incidence of food poverty is higher in 50% in rural areas and 6% in urban areas. The significant concerns regarding the performance of every crop is behind often sugar cane and the in the world. In the local countries like United States, China, France, Mexico, these islands, and India. In addition to water shortage, lack of agricultural input, nitrogen fertilizers, unsanitization, and poor irrigation practices are many factors for low crop yield. Furthermore, climate change also is supposed to affect agricultural production adversely. For example, the nitrogen used in the air for and the rise of the double acid fast. Pakistan is focused on all inputs water to get long-term impact on its quality. It's a human and environmental health consequences because groundwater is used for drinking water. This can also cause eutrophication of groundwater dependent ecosystems such as wetlands, rivers, nitrogen deficiency for agriculture reforms for any vertical environmental sustainability, sustainable nitrogen management in agriculture needs to be focused. Production will be increased sustainability. This will involve education initiatives, environment centers, and like the nutrition, adequate food, employment, and income generation. Natural resources management and environmental protection. And this will further our efforts to
very young country. Can you imagine if I invite a leader then be India or not?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor Qureshi. I think the audio was not so clear, but we could make out a little bit. May I request all the speakers to turn on their cameras so we can take a nice group picture at the end, and to thank all the participants for joining us. It's been a really amazing and interesting discussions. So from us, all the speakers, the organizers, UNEP and UAF and the government of Pakistan and all the speakers, thank you to the nearly 400 people still online in an interesting 2 hours. Wishing our colleagues in Pakistan all the best for the World Environment Day celebrations tomorrow, and say goodbye. So maybe we can say goodbye.
Thank you, Mahesh,
Thank
and
you.
all of you for joining Pakistan University of Agriculture Festival for this webinar. I'm really thankful on behalf of university, my vice chancellor, director, and particularly the ministry. Thank you very much, Mark, Raghuram, Stephanie, Zamat, Director, Milka, and particularly Mahesh for coordinating all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Have you taken the photo?
Yes, yes.